Hey everybody, it is Professor Keegan, and we are looking at material for our Thursday session, which is material on Siobhan Somerville's piece that we read from her book, Queering the Color Line, in which we're going to be examining some of the intertwined histories of race, sexuality, and gender in US science and US law. And I'm assuming that a lot of you um, took a look at this reading and were possibly a little confused about a lot of the terminology, and this particular historical period also being one that we don't tend to study much, the late 19th century. So what I want to do is give you kind of a broad overview of some of the concepts that Somerville is drawing on to describe the interrelations between the invention of the racial hierarchy and the invention of the sex and gender system, and the way in which those two systems kind of co-constitute one another. And I'll also try to give you a lot of examples of kind of visual mapping of thought at the time to give you a sense of how medicine comes on the scene to reinforce a lot of the sex and gender and racial hierarchies we've been talking about in this period called Before Identity, which is really about sort of the systems put in place that then give us, by the 20th century, the idea of a queer community. So to get started, I'm starting with some craniometry charts. Craniometry was a pseudo-scientific practice by which some medical researchers thought they could prove that white and Black people were actually different species. They also thought they could prove the intelligence of people by the shape of their skull, as well as whether or not someone was likely to be a criminal or a pervert. Yes, we're now into that era of understanding the perversion of nature as a queer behavior. So that's just one of the practices that we will look at today. To begin with, we are thinking about sexuality and race in combination. So the first thing to really be aware of is that sexuality and race must always be thought of in combination in the case of US history, particularly because race is assumed to be reproduced through procreation or through sexuality itself, so that sexuality becomes a tool for the creation and enforcement of racial categories. And because of this, ideas of race and sexuality are intimately bound together in US culture, all the way back to sort of the policing and attempted extermination of indigenous people that we looked at last week, as well as the creation of stereotypes of African people as hypersexual that were then used to actually produce, through sexual violence, a domestic slave population in the United States. Largely through the rape of Black women by white men. So race and sex go together because sex is a tool for creating race and reinforcing race. Now, how we have done this in the United States is that historically we've sought to actually kind of sexually separate racial categories in order to preserve racial difference. So there's a lot of anxiety about interracial sexuality. Remember that interracial sex is actually made illegal under segregation and remains illegal in many US states right up until 1967. So this is what would be called a miscegenation law, a law banning the mixing of races, mis meaning mix, and genation referring to gene pools. And then also, of course, the practice of lynching Black men who are accused of being sexually aggressive with white women. All of this was put in place in the post-slavery period to avoid what white people were calling race suicide. And that was a 19th century term for the popular fear that declining white birth rates would lead to the end of white civilization. Now, this might sound kind of familiar to you, given the period of US history we're in right now, where we are yet again hearing, over a century later, another panic about there not being majority white population in the United States. And we see all of the kind of great lengths that certain white people are going to kind of control the border and um, police communities where people of color are living in an attempt to, again, kind of reinforce the idea that white people are the dominant group by numbers. So one thing that's really key here to the kind of race panic that sets in the late 19th century as so many immigrants are coming to the United States um, is this idea that the white race needed to be reproduced through proper heterosexual behavior. So that heterosexuality, as it comes into existence as an idea, it didn't exist as an idea prior to the late 19th century. It kind of comes on the scene as the other half of that binary of hetero and homo that we talked about, where homosexuality starts to get codified as a type of person who is different from others and therefore not normal, right? And then along in the wake of that comes the idea that most people are actually not homosexual, and so we need a name for those people. And so we start to call those people heterosexual. So heterosexuality as an idea starts to get linked to this idea of the reproduction of the white race, that we needed white people particularly to be heterosexual and to behave heterosexually in order to then reproduce white people and keep white people in a dominant position in terms of having the most people. The reproduction of the white race through straightness was imagined as crucial to historical and cultural progress, that like the white race needed to be shored up and defended from its own, from declining numbers through this kind of aggressive gender polarity and heterosexuality. So we start to have this understanding of fit and unfit people that is, again, about this kind of scientific redefinition of people as evolved or civilized or able to kind of engage in the mechanisms of democracy. Fit, meaning kind of rights-bearing white people, were viewed as having a cultural responsibility to use their sexuality to reproduce. So this would be like elite or wealthy white people were seen as kind of needing to have lots of babies so their sexuality became a tool by which the nation sought to kind of populate itself with like civilized fit white people. And then unfit white people, and this would be like poor white people, queer white people, disabled white people. These would be unfit white people who were viewed as failing the racial imperative to procreate and therefore kind of failing to be exemplars of the white race. So notice that like post-slavery, whiteness is no longer enough to guarantee your superiority, right? So we have now a new hierarchy of whiteness where there are fit whites and then there are unfit whites, white people who are still poor for some reason, even though they're white, or white people who are not thriving in kind of the new kind of post-slavery economy. And those unfit white people start to be an issue. Particularly, we start to understand unfitness as linked to queerness. And that's something we can talk about in a second. So all that is to say, the racial paradigm is shifting post-slavery, and we have the rise of what's known as eugenics. So between the 1880s and the 1930s, the United States goes through a kind of a flourishing of eugenics ideas. And this was a widely popular 20th century theory that you could manipulate the biological or genetic stock of a population in order to solve social problems. So the idea was that like problems like criminality and poverty were actually heritable. Like you could inherit a tendency to be poor, or you could inherit a tendency to commit crime. And so in order to kind of stabilize the nation, we had to weed out people who were genetically inferior because they were the ones causing all the problems. You can see how this set of ideas gets adopted by the Nazis in Germany and leads to World War II. Hitler kind of infamously got a lot of his ideas about Jews and their inferiority by looking at what the United States was doing in this period. So eugenics, which is eu meaning good and genics meaning genes, good genes, right? Was starting to be used to limit the rights and social mobility of people who were seen as unfit or inferior genetically. So people who were disabled, people who were not white, people who were perverted, meaning homosexual, queer in some way, gender inverted, and also people who were poor. All of these people were thought to be failing a kind of genetic lottery, and that therefore they needed to be incarcerated or institutionalized, or at least encouraged to not procreate so that they wouldn't pass along these kind of unfit genetics to their children. Eugenicists used medical diagnosis, forced institutionalization in mental wards and clinics and things like that, as well as forced sterilization to control the reproductive capacities of undesirable populations. This was practiced kind of widely on indigenous women, particularly, sterilization so that they couldn't have children. Many gay men were also chemically castrated, thinking that that would keep them from having sex. Women who just kind of like slept around too much or were too promiscuous also could end up being given like a hysterectomy by the state to control their behavior and their reproductivity. There's a very famous court case called Buck v. Bell, in which Carrie Bell was forcibly sterilized by the state of Virginia simply for like having a child out of wedlock. So you get the idea here, right? That like medicine was kind of seeking to control the sexual behavior of people along this idea that some people should not be allowed to reproduce because they were kind of dragging the nation down. By the 1890s, after the end of slavery and the Reconstruction period, marriage and immigration laws focused on limiting the reproduction and sexuality of undesirable social groups. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court until the middle of the 20th century, when we finally got things like Loving v. Virginia that struck down the laws making interracial sex illegal in many states. So the overall goal of this period of the eugenics movement was to preserve the racially pure, right, stock and property of the emerging white middle class in the post-slavery period. So notice how just because slavery is abolished doesn't mean the racial issues go away. We just have like a reconsolidation of the racial hierarchy through this new logic of sort of genetic science. And again, none of this was actually scientific, but people thought it was. So we should be very careful about, presuming that science can't be biased by cultural attitudes like racism. Here are some examples, right? You might be thinking, this sounds really wacky. Well, these are eugenics displays from the early 1900s. I think one of them is from the World's Fair in 1900 itself, in maybe Chicago, I think that was. On the top, it says, this light flashes every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. So notice right away they're lumping people with disabilities in with criminals. Down here it says, this light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. This light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person who is born in the United States who will have ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. So you can see how there's this new awareness that there are people who are failing the standards of fitness, maybe because of disability, maybe because they've broken the law, and that there's a real question about who is a burden on everybody else. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest, right? So even as we formalize US democracy post-slavery, there are all these questions about who should actually be able to participate that get reformulated through this question of science. Down here, right, fit and unfit marriages. You can see how people are being classified pure versus abnormal. So pure and pure marriages create normal children, abnormal and abnormal create abnormal children, pure and abnormal create tainted children, tainted and abnormal create normal but tainted, right? You can see how there's a kind of early genetic logic going on here, a sort of Lamarckian genetic logic about how heredity might work. People didn't understand the science of genes quite yet, but they were creating all of these weirdly hierarchical ideas about fitness and unfitness, tainted and pure, right? That really speak to kind of moral typologies. This one reads, how long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle, and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to blind sentiment, right? So I'd ask you to think about how a lot of this thinking is still around in terms of kind of like who deserves to, be American, who deserves to participate in democracy, and all of the efforts to kind of limit that participation along certain lines. Eugenics is one articulation of that idea. Here we have a fitter families contest. So just to go back, you'll notice that this top image is about a fitter families contest, which were these contests where white families would line up at county fairs to be judged by white judges as to how well they were embodying like ideal, pure, fit whiteness. And these are mothers at a county fair who have brought their babies to be judged almost as if they were, I don't know, cows at a county fair. And they would hand out medals for heritage and also the Better Babies medal. So yay, I have a goodly heritage. This is a medal that a fit family, a fit white family would receive. And then also, the best kind of fittest looking babies would receive Better Babies medals. Yeah, pretty bonkers, but something that we did and something that you can still see reflected in the politics of like whose kids matter in the United States. We have undocumented children locked up in cages on our border right now. So you might think about how this kind of practice relates to a practice like that. Some other things here. So what we're really talking about is a system of what we might call scientific racism. Eugenics is part of scientific racism, and it is a pseudoscientific set of procedures such as anthropometry, which was the study of the body's proportion and movements, and craniometry, which is a study of the shape and size of the skull, as you can see behind me, in order to divide humans into discrete groups based on species typologies. So again, this was the idea that, say, indigenous people weren't actually the same species as white people, and African or Black people were not actually the same species as Europeans, right? That these were actually different species of hominid, and therefore kind of like white people represented a more evolved species that deserved to kind of take over and treat these other species how we might treat animals. So scientific racists claimed that science could prove evolutionary differences between races and ethnic groups, i.e. whites were more evolutionarily developed than Black people, or white people were more evolutionarily developed than indigenous people. So you can see there's a taking of Darwinian science here and a misapplication of it to human culture, where people were saying, well, we're clearly the dominant species because we've simply outcompeted these other species. Isn't that what Darwin said would happen, right? Don't we deserve to take all this stuff because, Darwin said that it's just survival of the fittest, right? Well, Darwin didn't actually say that his theory is applied to human culture or to like, he didn't say that his theories were just capitalism, right? He was talking about reproductive rates pretty much only. So by that measure, whoever had the most children would be the fittest, not whoever owned the most stuff. So key to scientific racism is the measurement of anatomy to discover the body's racial and sexual properties. So this is where you get into measuring skulls, you get into measuring genitals to say that some people are of this species and some people are of that species. Anatomical types were codified and written into science as markers of perversion and racial inferiority. So this is the idea that a certain shape of skull could tell you that someone was of a certain race and therefore a different species, or therefore evolutionarily inferior. There was also a lot of attention paid to the genitals of women, saying, oh, well, this woman's genitals are shaped this way, so she is clearly like actually African, and then therefore actually like evolutionarily inferior to a white woman. So there was all this interest in measuring and looking at the body to decide who had the propensity for queerness or who had the propensity for criminality. And in this model, intersexuality and also gender nonconformity were thought to be evolutionarily inferior to binary sex and also gender polarity. So it was actually thought like people looked around and saw how, say, fish have a lot of intersex qualities and characteristics. Some fish can change sex kind of spontaneously. They looked at, say, insects. A lot of insects are either asexual or sort of intersexual. And they said, oh, look, these forms of sex difference occur lower in the food chain, occur among the lower species. And so if we see it in humans, it's an indication that those humans are less evolutionarily developed than, say, binary sexed people. Even though, again, this is not true. So, for example, this is just, I'm sorry, this lecture is just, you're probably wondering, what on earth is he talking about? But this is all true. It all happened. This is a polygyny table. So scientific racists believed in the theory of polygyny, which was the theory that humans had developed completely separate from one another on different continents, so that there were actually separate hominid species that were not related genetically to each other and that had developed in isolation. This actually is not true. There were other people called monogenists who believed that all humans descended from one common ancestor, and those people actually are right. All humans evolved from a shared ancestor in Africa. These polygynists thought that there were types of hominids or humans that had developed separately and that some were better than others. So you can see here how the thinking was that there were these like separate mammalian gene pools on each continent that resulted in very different types of species kind of variation amongst not all humans. Like white people would be a different species of hominid than, say, a person from Africa or a person from Asia. And you can see they also had really clear ideas about how different the skull shapes would be of these different species of people. So this was all invented to kind of excuse colonization. And it also came out of the very real differences people were discovering in the human population, right? Like a lot of these colonizers from Europe were running into Black people for the first time. And we're like, well, these people clearly are not human. They're clearly very different from us. Look, they come from this entirely different place. They must not be human. And so these theories develop out of this attempt to kind of classify the entire kind of biological system of the planet. But they make lots of errors, and those errors are used to support the oppression of non-white people and also the oppression of queer people, because key to this system was the enforcement of binary sex and also heterosexuality. So, this is an example of how gender ideals were also developing along these lines. So what we have here is an early anthropometry exhibit from a eugenics conference in 1921, where now we have photographic technology being used, showing the posture and proportions of an ideal white male body. So we still have some of these ideas, like there's this idea that gay men walk in a certain way, or that you can kind of tell when someone's queer because of how they move their hands or how they talk or how they walk. That all comes out of this period of kind of typifying the movements of the body as more or less ideal, where there was a proper posture for a manly white man to have, and people who could not meet those standards were considered to be pathological or less ideally male, and were kind of queered by their failure to perform these kinds of very rigid typologies of the body. So we see how proportions are being measured very carefully to show kind of the ideal posture and sort of ratio of proportions in the body. This, of course, is very racialized. So here, this is from 1922, an illustration drawn by author in Rovering to Success, a book of life sport for young men. Probably this book was handed out to young white boys as like how to be manly, and how to stave off accusations of homosexuality. We see a very upright white man, and then a less upright and ideal black man, and it says a white man and a man. And I think that's so reflective of kind of how we're starting to see not everyone counts as a man, really, right? There are white ideal men, and then there are other men who are unfit, right? All that is to say, what's happening in this period is that as sex and race, sexuality and race start to kind of be constructed through one another, that people of color start to be queered by their inability to perform these like very rigid standards for embodiment that are white, and queer people actually start to be kind of racialized as less than white or less than ideally white by their inability to conform to these very rigid structures of gender that are linked to the idea of procreating the white race through heterosexuality. So, how does this all work? Scientific racism and homosexuality. The period in which the ideal of the hetero-homo binary that we've been talking about, when that developed in the late 19th century, was also a time when boundaries between black and white become legally policed under US segregation. So what Somerville is saying is that there's a time in which the racial logics of slavery are being retranslated into segregation. We used to have slave and free, now we're going to have white and black as the binary. And in order to do that work, this binary of hetero-homo starts to be a co-constituting binary, so that the definition of homosexuality starts to be racialized, and the definition of, say, blackness starts to be queered. So that intelligence, queerness, and criminality were all assumed to be locatable through physical markers on the body, such as skin color, the size of the genitals, bodily movement, nose shape, skull shape. Were all being measured to kind of see who is fit and who isn't. So racialized or non-white, intersex and gender non-conforming bodies were thought to be less evolved than properly gendered white bodies. So if the old system was about slavery and some people just didn't have rights and couldn't hold rights because they were slaves, the new system is that some people are just more fit than others. And this is actually about like science. And science will do the work for us of reinforcing the hierarchy that we had set up under the original system of slavery. And so it all gets retranslated through this new kind of understanding of fitness and evolution. Interracial sex and homosexuality start to get recoded as similar to one another, and both are forms of perversion that involve wrong object choice. So being attracted to the wrong thing, or an unfit kind of sexuality, where you're attracted to people of a different race and therefore kind of a different species almost, or you are attracted to people like of your own gender and therefore you are failing the impetus to procreate. If you're white. If you're not white, you can't be fit. If you are white, you can be fit, but you got to be straight. Okay? You got to choose your objects properly. So cross-gendered behaviors like cross-dressing or engaging in typically gendered behaviors that aren't assigned to your sex were actually seen as threatening the survival of the white race. And that is a lot of why homophobia and transphobia are actually tied to kind of this fear of whiteness ceasing to function properly, that we kind of also see as like connected to this race suicide idea. That like if too many people become queer or start acting queerly, if too many white people use their freedom as white people to act in these ways, we will not have enough white children who are fit, who are raised properly, and therefore the white race will like decline and devolve and lose control. You can see how even fears about queer parents parenting children are related to this set of kind of anxieties from this period. So here is an example of scientific racism. This is a phrenology chart. Phrenology was the measurement of the face to reveal things like intelligence and criminality. Again, not scientific, but people thought it was. This is clearly an articulation of scientific racism in which the smarter face is whiter, and of course, the less intelligent face is less white, right? So again, thinking that, you know, there were these physical markers on the body that could reveal the capacity for intelligence. There's also, this is one of my favorite images from this class, the fear that if someone engaged in too much masturbation, that someone would just waste away to nothing, that they would kind of waste their energy on the wrong object, right? The self. So here, right, this says representing the last stage of mental and bodily exhaustion from onanism, i.e. masturbation. 19th century scientists believed that wasting one's sexuality on wrong objects, including oneself, was a sign of biological inferiority. And if someone, you know, masturbated too much, that meant that they were kind of contributing to the decline of the white race by, again, not procreating properly, and then therefore increasing the number of white people. And then I thought I'd end with this image. Remember that voting and reading the newspaper were thought of as cross-gendered behaviors for women, because we're also talking about the period where women were agitating for the right to vote, which was a traditionally male behavior. And so that was almost like a trans kind of practice where women were kind of starting to do things that men only could do. And there was a lot of anxiety about that. So in this cartoon, I forget when this is from. It's probably from the 19 teens to 20s. This woman who's taken over the role of the man in the household, and the man, look at him, he's just wasting away. He's just like becoming feminized and has nothing to do. He's sitting over there and he's clearly kind of emasculated by this mannish woman who's reading the newspaper and sitting at the desk and like has ideas. She's clearly like kind of squinting at the paper because she has ideas about politics, and it's called The Eclipse, a husband of women's suffrage. Women's suffrage meaning the right to vote for women. So again, fears that white women would get the vote and would kind of emancipate themselves from male control and then stop having children, and then, you know, white dominance would fall apart, right? All of this is to say that race is a really, really important factor in how gender and sexuality are being constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is the period of kind of racial history that we don't often talk about. And it's one of the most recent periods, kind of before the civil rights period that we're taught so much about. But this was the state of things, and this was how people thought of sexuality as a tool to reinforce racial hierarchy. And it's why, again, people of color start to be thought of as sexually non-normative, and queer white people start to be thought of as failing the dictates of their race in a way that makes them less fit whites. So I will leave it there. I'm really curious to see what you thought of all this. So I'll hope to see some ideas in your journals, and I'll look forward to reading your work. I'm gonna stop here, and I'll see you all next week.